Not too long ago, I was walking through my neighborhood in Washington, D.C. Some of you know that I divide my time between Cambridge and Washington. So walking through my neighborhood, and when I came across some street art, some graffiti, spray painted on the side of an alley wall. Just one sentence of white text on a black background. The text read, "It is in your self-interest to be very tender." It is in your self-interest to be very tender. And the sentence kind of stopped me in my tracks. I mean, it's not very often you see a piece of graffiti on the streets of D.C. or Boston or Cambridge promoting virtues like tenderness, right? I found myself moved that someone would speak up for tenderness on D.C.'s tough streets, that someone would come to the defense of tenderness in the capital of a nation whose culture is too often marked by violence and acrimony. And looking back on it from the standpoint of today, with lives now being brutally sacrificed in a seemingly intractable conflict, tenderness seems even more vulnerable and in need of our championing. But what really felt audacious about the graffiti was its claim that tenderness was somehow in our self-interest. Not just an expression of virtue or altruism, but in our interest. I worried that the sentiment might be naive, but it also struck me as essential. Without tenderness, what else is there? What else do we have? I'd be curious to know how that sentence strikes you. How is it in your self-interest to be tender? One circumstance in which tenderness can certainly be in our interest is when we are tender with our own imperfect selves. When we can be gentle and kind to ourselves. Because let's face it, we're often our own worst critics, aren't we? Not long ago, I led a New Year's meditation retreat at a Unitarian church not far from here. I began by inviting participants to simply reflect on the year that had just ended, to consider what they were grateful for, where the holy had shown up for them in the past year, and what, if anything, needed to be forgiven in order to embrace the new year. And when the practice was over, a young woman said to me, "Rob, that was so hard for me to do, because whenever I reflect back on my life and my actions, I'm always beating myself up, critical of the choices I've made, filled with regret for the things I've done or not done." And I hear this so often from people that I counsel. It seems that many of us struggle with this voice in our heads that is not just self-critical, but self-punishing. A curious thing I've discovered over the years about Unitarian Universalists is that while we are often the first to speak out on behalf of another's inherent worth and dignity, we often struggle to believe in our own. Maybe that's not unique to Unitarians. So what I'd like for us to wrestle with this morning is how we might suffer a little less by showing ourselves a little more tenderness. And I'd like to begin with a little teaching of the Buddha's, because the Buddha was so thoughtful and wise in his understanding of our suffering. The Buddha had a kind of thought experiment that he liked to share with people. He'd say, look, imagine that you are, I'm paraphrasing here, Imagine that you're walking in the woods and out of nowhere an archer slings an arrow at you and strikes you. Would it hurt? He asked his students. Well, yes, it would hurt, they said. And now, said the Buddha, imagine that soon after being struck by that first arrow, you were struck by yet another one. Would that not hurt even more? Would your pain not be compounded? Yes, said the students, of course it would. The Buddha went on to explain that the first arrow in the story represents all the pain and suffering, great and small, that life inevitably sends our way. None of us can avoid this arrow, the Buddha taught. We all face pain and difficult situations in our lives. We all suffer. But that second arrow, said the Buddha, that's the suffering we inflict upon ourselves by how we react to the first arrow, how we respond to our pain and misfortune, the stories we tell ourselves about it. The Buddha called this self-inflicted wound the second arrow of suffering. The second arrow of suffering. And this suffering, this is something we can avoid, or at least minimize, if only we were a little more compassionate toward ourselves, a little more tender. The second arrow of suffering. I'll share an example from my own life, and maybe you'll think of some of your own. So 3 or so years ago, at the very beginning of the pandemic, I was riding my bicycle in downtown Washington and narrowly avoided being struck by a taxi cab. But in my effort to avoid the collision, I braked suddenly, flew over the handlebars of my bike, landed on the pavement, and broke both of my arms. Thank you for that groan of solidarity. That actually helps. Thank you. Now, in the Buddha's parable, this is the first arrow of suffering, right? The pain and misfortune, sometimes small, sometimes great, that life inevitably sends our way. We can't do anything about it. But it wasn't long before other arrows started raining down on me. And one of them was self-blame. Right? I blamed myself for the accident. I said to myself, well, you should have been more careful. You shouldn't have braked so suddenly. Why were you riding downtown in the first place? This punishment blame tape played over and over in my head, causing me even more pain. That was the second arrow of suffering, my response to the first arrow. But if only it had stopped there. Arrow number 3 was my self-pity, right? Woe is me, I thought. Here I am in the middle of a pandemic, trying to hold a church together, trying to keep my son focused on his online learning, trying to keep my family healthy, and now I break my arms? Both of them? Really? Why do things like this always happen to me, right? My self-pity. The net result, of course, was now that not only did I experience the physical pain and inconvenience of 2 broken arms, but I'd compounded my suffering with all the stories I was telling myself. Do you remember a time when the stories you told yourself about your suffering only added to your pain? This is the pattern we seek to interrupt. How do we minimize the self-inflicted wounds caused by the second arrow of suffering? How do we do that? Well, we can't do it if first we don't notice and admit to ourselves that we're flinging these arrows in the first place. And sometimes they just come as such second nature, we don't even know we're doing it, right? And also, when we're suffering, we often experience our suffering as one great undifferentiated mass of pain. It's hard to break it down sometimes into its component parts, right? To differentiate among the multiple vectors of our suffering. When I broke my arms, I fell into a depression. And that depression was like living inside a huge bank of fog. I couldn't see anything clearly. At first, it felt like a reasonable response to what had happened, but then after a while, I noticed, gosh, my arms were feeling better, but I was still in a world of pain. And that's when I finally took a moment to just kind of step back and create a little distance between me and my emotions, and notice that my suffering wasn't coming from my arms anymore, but from all those punishing stories I was telling about myself. And here it's helpful to not only notice the stories we're telling ourselves, these second arrows that we've flung, but to actually go ahead and name them if we can. Give them a name. Naming our emotions can help us get some distance from them, help us externalize them a little bit so we can hold them up and examine them. It's almost like we have to take our quiver of arrows off of our back, and take all the arrows out one by one and look at them and say, oh, that's self-pity. There it is, right? And oh, this one's self-blame. There it is. One of the helpful things about noticing and naming our feelings is that we sometimes see patterns emerge. We discover that there are, in fact, certain arrows in our quiver that we go back to time and time again. Noticing these patterns can give us important insight into the habitual ways that we react to misfortune and compound our suffering. I wonder if we could all take a moment right now and take our quiver off our shoulders, right? And just take a look at those arrows. What are your habitual ways of responding to pain and misfortune? What are the stories that you tell yourself again and again? Are they helpful? Or do they merely compound your suffering? Now, I find that at this point in the process, at this point of discovering and naming the harm that we sometimes inflict on ourselves, it's really easy for us to launch yet another arrow from our quiver by beating ourselves up for all the arrows we've already flung at ourselves, right? By chastising ourselves for having added to our own suffering. Rob, you wouldn't be depressed right now if you hadn't wallowed in your self-pity for so long, right? You can see how if we're not careful, it's just this spiral, right? Kaylee was talking about the spiral with the kids earlier. That's why we need to interrupt the cycle. That's why at some point we need to call a truce with ourselves. Lay down our slings and arrows. Make peace with ourselves. Be at peace with ourselves. And this is where tenderness comes in. We can interrupt this cycle of self-inflicted suffering by simply showing ourselves a little compassion, by noticing, but not judging, the stories we always tell ourselves, just noticing them with a kind attention and a compassionate heart. Oh, look how I've been blaming myself all this time for that stupid bike accident. Look how I've been feeling self-pity. Maybe I can just be good to myself and let it go. In fact, what we really want to do is go all the way back to that first arrow, the one that we didn't have any control over, the suffering that life inevitably sends our way, and acknowledge that pain that we suffered. and be compassionate with ourselves around that pain. To say to ourselves, Rob, yeah, it really did kind of suck to have arms broken at the beginning of the pandemic. I'm sorry that happened. That's the kind of understanding and compassion that we'd show to a friend, wouldn't we? Maybe we can extend that same compassion to ourselves. I just wonder if some of us aren't still holding pain and suffering in our bodies that we never really gave ourselves the time or space to acknowledge or to grieve. I wonder if we can't hold those painful places in our lives in a gentle and compassionate embrace. It is in your self-interest to be very tender. The truth is, the more tender we are with ourselves, the more tender we can be with others. The more compassionate we are with ourselves, the more compassion we can share with the world. And having made peace with ourselves, we're better able to show up as peacemakers in a world very much in need of them. This sermon was conceived and mostly written long before the recent escalation of violence in Israel, Palestine, and Gaza. It was intended to be a pastoral and personal sermon. Yet preaching it now, I can't help but wonder if the Buddha's wisdom about the second arrow of suffering doesn't apply to this larger global context, because when conflict and suffering erupt in our world, we also have a tendency to fall back on familiar stories that we tell ourselves about that conflict or that suffering, right? It seems the Buddha would invite us to gently examine and interrogate those stories. Are our stories complex enough to do justice to the situation? Do the stories we tell and the actions that flow from them compound suffering or lessen it? Do the stories we tell about a conflict equip us to be peacemakers or not? And most importantly, do our stories prevent us from sharing with others what we so desperately need from one another in these times, which is compassion and solidarity and love? If we're not careful, the sky will become dark with our arrows. So friends, may we be tender with ourselves and with others. And may we be at peace with ourselves so that we can be peacemakers in our world. Will you please join with me now in a moment of silent reflection? Amen.